at the beginning of this video. First, Wednesday, September the 17th, is Constitution Day. It's the 227th anniversary of the ratification of the Constitution, which coincides pretty well with our discussions over the past couple of weeks. Also, I sent out an announcement today, or I posted an announcement about AEI is conducting their annual constitutional lecture. And I think the title this year is The Constitution as Political Theory. And you can actually stream the video. It's not required, but if you guys are interested in the subject matter, which I hope you are, it'd probably be a great learning experience. It's 5 o'clock on Tuesday, and you can find it through the link that I posted. The second thing is I posted final paper information on the Canvas website. So it has instructions for what I'm looking for in the final paper. It has final paper topics. It has a protocol to follow if you decide that you don't want to choose one of those particular topics. And I also posted my grading rubric. So if you guys have any questions about any of that, please feel free to shoot me an email. Okay, so last week we were looking at the Anti-Federalists and trying to uncover their opposition to the Federalists and the Constitution that came out of the convention. So perhaps one of the first places to start is to try to figure out whether that name Anti-Federalists is actually true or not. Because many of the Anti-Federalists actually consider themselves to be the true Federalists. Because when you think about the definition of federalism, it's a system of government where sovereignty is divided between a central government and its constituent parts, which in the case of the United States are the states. So the Anti-Federalists were making the argument that that the Federalists were proposing too strong of a central government and not giving enough power to the states. So they were arguing actually that the people who deemed themselves the Federalists were actually proposing more of a nationalistic system of government versus a federal. You know, and they even sort of deemed themselves such by some of the letters that came from the Anti-Federalists were called the Federal Farmer. So I think one was called the Republic Confederation. So they clearly saw themselves as Federalists and not as Anti-Federalists. Of course, it's the case that the victors write history, right? So the people that were on the Federalist side, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay, George Washington, those guys ended up winning out in some degrees. We'll talk about sort of the compromises that came out of what the Anti-Federalists were writing. But because they won, they're known as the Federalists, and the other folks became known as the Anti-Federalists. So one thing to mention was, so we looked at the essays of Brutus. It was interesting that all of these folks actually wrote under pseudonyms. And you think about Hamilton and Madison, they wrote under the name of a guy, Publius, who was a very famous Roman senator in the Roman Republic. Publius also means friends of the people. And Brutus, Brutus, of course, also from the Roman Republic and of Julius Caesar fame, the guy who was supposedly defending Rome against the tyrant, who was Julius Caesar. So this guy, who is purportedly Robert Yates, is pretty much what is historically believed to be the Brutus who submitted these Anti-Federalist papers. But yeah, so the pseudonyms are important, and in this case, he thought he was actually representing sort of freedom from tyranny. So that's the reason that he chose the pseudonym Brutus. So what were some of the arguments that Brutus was making? And I saw, a lot of the conversations that came up in the discussions were talking about taxes, and that's exactly right. That's what he was primarily concerned about, was the power of the federal government to tax. And essentially, he said that the justification that was listed in the Constitution for the power to levy taxes was this idea of providing for the common defense and sort of promoting the general welfare. And Brutus says, well, those are pretty vague terms, right? So if you want to, say that you're going to raise taxes to provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, then, pretty much anything could fall under that particular purview. And he said, look, the power of taxation that is given to the federal government under this particular constitution is simply too great because those terms are too broad. So that was one of the big problems that Brutus had with the particular taxation that was set up. It wasn't just the taxes, but it was this idea, this argument that Hamilton makes that if you're going to task a government with certain ends, you have to provide that government with the means to do that. And he says that the ends that were provided under the Constitution were simply too broad. So that was the problem that he had with that. And of course, his fear was that if the federal government had these very strong powers of taxation, they would essentially crush the power of the states themselves. Because he comes up with this, mantra. It's a very famous saying: "No man can serve two masters." Right. So if the government has has the power to levy these particular taxes, so if the federal government has the power to levy those taxes, and not only that, the thing that Brutus was particularly concerned with was not only do they have the power to levy the taxes, but it's also written in that they are going to have the power to interpret and enforce those particular taxes, right? So if they're going to have all the money, there's that other famous saying, "He who controls the purse controls the sword, and he who controls both the purse and the sword control everything." So if it ever turns out to be the case that taxation is becoming too big of a burden on the citizens because the states are going to have to tax, because state governments do have a role to play, and the federal government is going to impose taxes as well, if it ever turns out to be the case that this is too burdensome on the public, then the federal government has the authority now through the Constitution to suspend state taxes. So it's going to usurp the powers of the state in that way. Another thing that they were very concerned about was the fact that there was no protection of individual liberties. Almost every state constitution had a Bill of Rights that protected the people from the encroachment of the central government. In many ways, the anti-federalists thought, we just had a revolution to overthrow a strong central government. So why do we want to put another one back into place? We saw what happened the last time when we had a strong central government. They just took over, right? The central, in Britain, they essentially did whatever they want and disregarded the liberties of the individuals. So they were afraid that the same thing was going to happen, and this is one of the reasons why they were pushing very strongly to include a Bill of Rights, to put some sort of check into place to limit the powers of the central government. And of course, the 10th Amendment of the Bill of Rights actually said that any power that is not expressly given to the national government is actually falls under the purview of the state governments. So it wasn't only protecting the rights of the individuals. The 10th Amendment, part of the Bill of Rights, protected the rights of the states themselves, and sort of the amendment that's often known as sort of the Federalist Amendment, because it sets up the federal structure that our government functions under. Okay, so essentially those were the essays of Brutus. Another big concern that he had was the creation of a standing army. Hamilton thought that you can't be respected as a legitimate government on the international stage if you don't have a standing army. But he said that, or Brutus was saying that, the standing armies are often known to be a danger to the liberties of the people, because, often throughout history, the people who have had the strong army, Caesar, for example, marched his army into Rome and overthrew the Republic and established a dictatorship. So how were they going to be guaranteed that wasn't going to happen in the United States? So, and then we looked at an article by Chris Mooney, and he was arguing that recently there has been a resurgence of sort of anti-federalist perspectives that have come back into sort of American political culture. He argued that this sort of started with the Reagan administration and sort of their admonishment of big government. Reagan's famous saying that government is the problem, government is not the solution, so we need to decrease government in a sense. And of course, it was interesting because the people that were promoting this, at least in Mooney's article, is somebody or a group known as the Federalist Society, and they were actually promoting the anti-federalist objectives, which of course brings us back to the original point. Perhaps the anti-federalists were the actual Federalists themselves. So there's definitely some ambiguity there regarding that. Yeah, and Mooney, he makes the argument, that the anti-federalists were kind of crazy. Their impact was minimal. He made the same argument that Hamilton made, that the government was not working under the Articles of Confederation. It was going to be anarchy. So we needed a stronger government in place, and the people that point to the anti-federalists as sort of founders and things are kind of crazy, because he argues, of course, that if those folks that were on the anti-federalist side had won out, then there would be no U.S. government. It would be just like all the other confederacies throughout history that have failed. So yeah, and he makes the argument. He points out that Jefferson made the same point, to attribute the Constitution to the anti-federalists is crazy. It's attributing it to the opposing party versus attributing it to the people who actually wrote it. However, they did play a big part, right? I mean, I think Mooney treats them a little bit unfairly, because when people think in the United States, when we think about what is the hallmark of our democracy, the first thing people point to is the Bill of Rights, right? Right to free speech, protection of individual liberties, 10th Amendment, setting up the federal system of government, which was not in place under the Constitution as first written. So the Anti-Federalists did, in fact, play a huge role, whether Mooney thinks so or not. So yeah, but it was interesting to see sort of first anti-federalism, come up in this particular case, and to see Mooney's sort of dismissal of the perspective, which I would argue is probably unfounded. Okay, yeah, so we had the discussion last week. The discussion question was essentially, were the fears of the anti-federalists valid? Has it been the case that that the states have lost their power and the central government has gained more power? And as we'll see, as we read the articles this particular week, it's a difficult question to answer, because one of the articles we read, I believe it's Derthick, she says that American federalism was born in ambiguity, and you'll see when Madison is talking about this in the Federalist paper that we're reading, he discusses how under the Constitution as it's currently written, the U.S. system of government is not really a federalist government, nor is it a nationalist government. It's sort of a mix between the two. So it's always hard to sort of reconcile, whether it's a federalist government and whether or not the U.S. has usurped the powers of the states too much. It's kind of a seesaw in a lot of ways. Sometimes, depending on who's in power, it seems like it goes more towards the federalist side, where the states are going to have more power. In other cases, depending on who's in office, it looks like it's becoming more of a nationalist government. If you wanted to stereotype, you could say, with the Democrats, the Democratic Party, at least of the last 30 or 40 years, at least since Johnson was in office, it seems like the Democratic Party is associated with a more nationalistic agenda, where the government is becoming bigger, and the Republican Party is more associated with this idea of smaller government and federalism. It's a rough analog, but there are some comparisons there. So yeah, you guys brought up that the anti-federalist biggest fear were the taxes, right, and the taxes' ability to usurp the powers of the states, which is exactly right. But of course, the argument that at least that Brutus is making for that is that this notion of means and ends, right? Like the ends that the U.S. government was supposed to support under the Constitution, this idea of providing for the common safety and promoting the general welfare, were simply too broad, right? And that the states themselves had very particular ends, and those ends were supposed to be, promoting justice between individuals and society. Regulating local commerce, not interstate commerce, and dealing with local issues. And as Brutus says, the purpose of government should be to save men's lives, not to destroy them. And this goes back to, he gives a historical example of all the governments from Europe, for example, were very militaristic, and they were always trying to increase their power. So in that sense, the end of government, in the 18th, 17th, 16th, probably all the way back, was to increase their power. So it was in a sense, to destroy other men's lives to gain power. But he said, look, we're at the dawn of a new age of government, and the purpose of government should be to save men's lives. And the way that you save men's lives is through civil government, where you put these institutions in place to ensure that there are individual liberties are protected, and that commerce, it can function in the society, and people can trust one another. And Brutus's argument is that the states were more well equipped to do this, right? They're the ones who are actually on the ground doing this, protecting people on a local level. So yeah. And then one student actually pointed out, it was a really interesting study that was conducted by, I believe it was the Washington Post, where he was talking about how most of the policies that have been put into place over the last 30 or 40 years have favored the elite and the special interest groups, and don't seem to favor sort of the common person. So that, of course, begs the question: has this notion of factions that Madison and Hamilton were so concerned about, have they actually taken over? And the key characteristic of a republic, which Madison talks about in this particular week's Federalist paper, Madison says, the key characteristic of a republic is that it has to be representative of the people. And it sounds like, based on that particular study that was quoted in the Washington Post, it looks like our system of government is not a republic anymore, because it's not representing the broad interests of the people. And in that case, Madison says, we need to rethink what we're doing, right? If we've gotten that far away, and perhaps we have. But yeah, to this question of whether the fears of the anti-federalists were justified, have the state's powers been taken away? As I said, it's a difficult question to answer, and you're going to see that in Derthick's paper this particular week, because she points to certain cases when she was writing her particular paper that seemed to suggest that federalism was sort of resurgent, kind of along the same lines as Mooney. The Brady laws were put into place under the Clinton administration, and the Brady laws are essentially the background checks on when somebody purchases a firearm. But the Supreme Court actually ruled that a clause under the Brady Act was unconstitutional, because it required state officials to carry out federal policy. So this would be a case where states' rights are being protected, right? The states can't be commandeered, as it's called. They can't be commandeered by the federal government to carry out their own activities. So that was one example. Another example that she pointed out was U.S. v. Lopez, which was a case where a student was bringing a firearm into school grounds, and the Constitution made a law that said that people weren't allowed, essentially students weren't allowed to bring guns into school zones, because and the argument that they made, and this is the argument that was eventually turned over, was that it affected interstate commerce in a negative way when students were bringing firearms and weapons onto school campuses. But the Supreme Court once again overthrew that because they said that it did not fall within the congressional purview of interstate commerce. So there's another case where it was saying this needs to be left to the states. We can't legislate this at the federal level. So those are two cases where it looks like federalism was winning out. But then she goes on to point out some other cases, right? Something called the Motor Voter, the National Voter Registration Act, where the federal government put into place that when people register for their cars or to get their driver's license, they have the opportunity to register to vote. And talking about certain types of absentee voter ballots for people who weren't able to attend, and other sort of voting policies that were put into place under this that were essentially being legislated from the federal level. And this seems like a case where it was more nationalistic. So there's something on the other side. Something about about welfare. Welfare is another big one where people were making the argument that here was the federal government again trying to legislate to the states. What should be done with people who don't meet a certain income threshold. But it turned out to be the case that the law was put into place where states actually had control of their own programs, and the federal government would match that. Another case of well-functioning federal government. But then there are other things that are in place, like Social Security, the Earned Income Credit tax. So once again, it's really hard to say, right? I mean, it's probably hard to argue that the powers of the national government have not been increasing. And another student pointed this out in the discussion and said, look, the size of the United States has increased. Things have become more technologically advanced, right? So in order to keep up with both the growth in the population, growth in the area, to keep up with the technological advances, it seems like the powers of the national government are going to have to increase to keep up with that. However, there's still a lot of there are a lot of safeguards that are put into place in the Supreme Court, which Hamilton argues, in the Federalist Papers, says, look, this is a check against the encroaching powers of nationalism. Seems to be interpreting the law in some cases on the Federalist side. But of course, that largely depends, likely, on who's on the Supreme Court, right, and what their ideologies are, because it seems pretty clear that their political ideologies do in fact influence their interpretations of the Constitution. So tough nut to crack there, whether the anti-federalist fears were true or not. However, it does seem like Madison's fear of a republic not representing the broad concern of the people, when looking at that Washington Post survey, seems to be a little more alarming. So certainly something to consider in that case. But hey, I mean, this is a great week to be having this debate, right? Because we're celebrating the Constitution, and Constitution certainly has its flaws, but likely things would be quite different in the world if there was no United States government, for good or ill. I'd like to think for good, but certainly in need of some revamping. Okay, so this week we're going to be looking at some more of the Federalist Papers. Hamilton's going to be making more arguments for the strength of the Constitution. Madison's going to be trying to figure out whether the Constitution sets up a nationalist government or Republican government, some of the safeguards that are put into place through the federal system to prevent the imposition of the national power. And then we're also going to look at Derthick's article on American federalism, half full or half empty. And she says, look, there are a couple of ways to interpret this. One is that federalism is sort of being revamped in our society. The other is that nationalism is on the march. So it's a tough situation. Anyway, if you guys have any questions about the final papers, assignments for this particular week, please feel free to send me an email. I'm happy to go over anything with you. Have a great week.